Hello and welcome to Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I interview founders doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on people with a connection to Latin America. My guest today is Jonathan Nelson, founder of Hackers and Founders, the largest network of entrepreneurs in the world. They created the Hackers and Founders Co-op, an accelerator and founders cooperative for high-growth startups, which now has a portfolio of companies worth more than $600 million today. We talk about how Jonathan went from growing up as the son of missionaries in Central America to coming back to the US and becoming a nurse, to moving to LA and then to Silicon Valley to start a startup. After starting a meetup with a few other guys in a bar to talk about startup issues, Hackers and Founders was born and has morphed into the organization that it is today. We first met via his co-op in Guadalajara, Mexico, and we covered the ecosystem there and what he sees happening in the Latin America startup system going forward over the next 5 to 10 years. I really hope you enjoy the conversation with Jonathan Nelson. Hello, Jonathan, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, man. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to do it. It's great to catch up.
My pleasure, man. Absolutely.
So, where are you in the world today?
Where in the world am I today? I am in San Jose, California, the capital of Silicon Valley, or so they say. We have offices in downtown San Jose, and when we moved to the Bay Area about a decade ago, we found a lovely house for relatively cheap compared to Silicon Valley, and so we've decided to stay down here as opposed to going up to San Francisco.
And so tell me a little bit about Hackers and Founders.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a strange organization. We started about a decade ago. When I moved to the Valley, I heard that the success rate of startups is 1 out of 10, so I figured I'd have to build 10 companies. And if it took me 10 years to build a successful company, well, I was okay with that. And so I moved to the Valley. I was actually working as a nurse at the time. I had finished most of a software engineering degree and online, and I was coding 4 nights a week and working at a hospital 3 nights a week. And 1 night a week, I started an event called Hackers and Founders. And it was nerds getting together in a bar talking about startups. Those events have kind of become a thing. People have now held Hackers and Founders events in 120 cities around the globe. And a couple 100,000 entrepreneurs have actually attended our events. Out of that, in 2010, 2011, we started seeing a bunch of entrepreneurs coming to Silicon Valley from overseas and wanting to set up offices here. They really had a hard time dealing with, what lawyers should I talk to? What banks should I talk to? How do I not get taken advantage of? How do I raise money in town? How do I do business development? And so we started a program which we call the Founders Cooperative, or the Co-op. And we help companies land in Silicon Valley and then scale globally. And we've worked with 55 companies in our Founders Co-op. Those companies have raised about $100 million in aggregate. They are now worth about $600 million in total. We have had 7 exits from our portfolio, or 7 acquisitions. And we started offices in Mexico for companies scaling across the Spanish-speaking world. And that's kind of us. We're part community, part venture thing.
That's a pretty good hit rate with having a portfolio worth $600 million from 55 companies. That's doing well.
So most of that is a handful of companies that have gone on to raise a ton of money and are spending a lot of money, making a lot of money, doing a ton of revenue run, and which means money coming in, money coming out every month. And they're doing quite well, and that's most of the value of our portfolio is in a handful of companies.
Yeah, I mean, that's normal in a portfolio. You're going to have your few winners, and the rest will hopefully do well as well, but you have your standouts.
Yeah, everything else tends to become a rounding error when you have a company worth, $300 million.
So when you first started Hackers and Founders, all the way back in the beginning where it was people meeting up in a bar, what was the niche that you were to fill that the other events weren't doing?
So back in my day, in 2007 and 2008, when I moved to Silicon Valley, there were a lot of events that did speakers. A lot of people really liked going to conferences, and then they hung out in the hallway and talked to people. And really, it wasn't much of a niche I was trying to fill. It was really getting out of my wife's hair, because I was either working or at home coding, and I believe the phrase was, "Honey, I love you, but for the love of God, get out of the house one night a month. Go talk to somebody else about startups." No, honey, you need to build your business network. So it'd be good for you to go out and network. And really, that's what Hackers and Founders was. And it really kind of grew organically from there.
And how did you know, or what was the inflection point from when you were just meeting up in a bar to deciding that, no, there's a real organization here where we can provide services and do the co-op?
And so I don't know that it was an inflection point. It was much more of, I was very interested in building a software company and building a software product. And, I'm kind of a finance nerd. And so I was trying to build a search engine for financial news coming out of emerging markets. Was my last software company. But literally after every meetup, we would have events where like 200 to 300 people would show up at a bar and said, "Hey, do you know anybody who did this? Hey, hey, I'm raising money. Who should I talk to?" And I just thought it was crazy that, dude being a nurse, having this meetup in a bar, like people are coming to me and asking for help. And I'm like, I'm not successful. I'm not the dude. But I would just try to be helpful, and I'd try to connect people. And so after every event, it would generally take me a day or two to catch up on email, just making introductions for people. And I decided that I was going to start talking to investors. And how I led with investors, and my original move was I was going to start meeting investors so that I could ask them for advice on what to do with my meetup. And in 9 months, I'd pitch them for my search engine for financial news, my Bloomberg for emerging markets. And so I started talking to investors about Hackers and Founders and this explosion of entrepreneurship around the globe. And they'd be like, "Well, introduce me to some companies." Like, "Okay, who do you want to meet?" And this was Naval at AngelList when they were getting started. He's like, "If you find great companies, I'm trying to connect companies with investors. And so introduce them to me." And so Naval kind of gave me his investment thesis, kind of like a little mini AngelList profile. So being a lazy engineer, we sent off a couple of emails to our mailing list. We had people fill in a little 5-question questionnaire, like, what's your pitch? What kind of traction do you have? Who's on your team? Blah, blah, blah. And then I had other entrepreneurs review and score these. And then the top scoring startups got a 20, 30-minute meeting with Naval. And after 3 months, we'd introduced him to 18 companies. And at the end of it, he's like, "Holy crap, you have this kind of deal flow? Where did you meet these people?" And I'm like, "What's deal flow?" He's like, "Have you thought about starting a fund?" And I was like, "No, I'm a nurse. I'm building a search engine for financial news." He's like, "How many do you know, like these 8 out of these 18? And I'm like, "Last week, if I know what you're talking about, I think I met 3. He's like, "Drop everything you're doing and start an accelerator or a fund." And I laughed at him. But Naval tells you to start an accelerator or a fund, and you kind of listen to the old man. And, well, I shouldn't say old. You listen to the man, and his advice, which I think was actually really ahead of its time, was, "Jonathan, the sources of capital for companies are going to come from many different places in the future. And the old venture model of I'm going to buy 20% of your company and buy a board seat on your company, and I'm going to be on 10 boards as a VC, he's like, this doesn't scale. And you're right. The world of entrepreneurship is scaling around the globe, so we need to come up with new models." He's like, "In a perfect world, if a startup is fundable, they should go to a website, click a button, and they should be able to receive money. If they're fundable, that's a perfect market." He's like, "I want to build that. But startups are still going to need help if they can get money off of a website. And so build like a services API for startups. I'll build a financial API, you build a services API, and together we'll scale the industry. Like, okay. So what do I do? He's like, get together. Here's your first 8 companies. Get together, help them help each other out. Frankly, entrepreneurs in a support group are going to do much better, give each other much better advice than necessarily someone with a pure finance background who has an easy time raising $100 million fund but has never run a company. The entrepreneurs are going to give each other much better advice than the investors probably will. So get them together on a regular basis, help them out, and we'll do a digital demo day on AngelList. And if they have a thing, if they raise, you have a thing. Okay. So we did. And out of those 8 companies, after 3 months, 2 of them had died. The founding teams couldn't get along. The remaining 6 all got at least a seed check. Some of them ended up, 3 of them have actually been acquired since then. One of them is stuck in Latvia because of immigration reasons, which is one of the reasons I got involved in policy and politics. One of them is the largest staffing agency for animators in visual effects and video gaming world. It's called Zerply, and one of them is going to do about $400 million in business this year. And so that was kind of the beginning, and it wasn't a plan. It was kind of accidental, and we were certainly deliberate about kicking ass and doing a great job at whatever it was that we were doing, but really it was the needs of the entrepreneurs, our customers kind of beating us over the head with their problems that we said, oh, yeah, I guess I can solve your problems. Yeah, I guess I can turn that into a business. But it was this customer problem that no one really felt like no one was really addressing, which led us to kind of start the co-op. It took us a couple of years to figure out the business model, but I think we finally ended up nailing it, and I'm really kind of excited about it.
Is the business model today the business model you started with, or did you iterate to finding what you found today?
No, so we tried a bunch of different business models. So Naval wanted us to keep on going and do another cycle immediately after the first, and I was like, I gotta go work at the hospital this weekend. Like, how do I make money at this? He's like, look, man, you can do your startup and raise money for that. And if you take a couple rounds of funding, you'll end up owning, maybe 30% of your own company by the time you exit or IPO, if you're lucky. Or you can work with hackers and founders. You can get 1 or 2 percentage points on, a broad portfolio of companies over a decade. 6 or 7 years, you'll be a really rich man, and your risk profile is a lot lower because you're more diversified. Okay, but how do I pay my bills? It's like, well, generally people would raise a venture fund and live off the management fees. And I was like, that's not me. I'm not a VC dude. I'm currently working as a nurse and coding most of the time. And so we looked at a bunch of different business models. We looked at education and teaching classes. We looked a lot at the sponsorship model. We looked really hard at like a co-working space model. We actually ended up in a really tricky situation with a law firm who I thought was going to represent us, but then they ended up trying to cut a deal with us in exchange for exclusive representation. And I'm like, I can't do exclusives. Oh, no, just sign it. And so there was a long, tortuous path. Eventually, we kept coming back to this idea that startups don't have cash, but they do have equity. So is there a way for them to give us a bit of equity and for us to get some cash based off of that equity? And that's kind of what led to our co-op business model and our inventing a new type of fund for that.
And so let's jump back. You talked about being a coding nurse and having an interesting background. Let's jump back into how you got to get where you are today and your connection to Latin America. And then we'll go back into, so where are you from originally? You're from the Midwest, right?
Yeah, so my family's from Minnesota. Mom and dad were missionaries in Central America. So I was literally the only white child at the end of 6 hours of dirt road in rural Honduras. We lived in an adobe house. I had many friends with dirt floors. We had tile. when I was 14, we ended up moving back to the States. When I graduated from high school, my initial idea was, yes, I'm going to be a missionary, of course, like my parents. And Dad said, okay, well, before you just go to seminary, why don't you get a trade? And I was like, oh, cool. I love computers. I'm going to, I've been running your database and mailing list for, since I was 7. I'm going to do computer science. Dad is like, yeah, no, son, computers are video game machines, and I don't want a son playing video games the rest of his life. That was in 1990. He's like, you should be a nurse like your mom. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, it was really helpful when we were in the middle of a jungle to know what kind of antibiotics to take and how to boil the water and sanitation and health and all of that sort of stuff. Be a nurse. I was like, oh, okay. So I became a nurse, and then I went to a Bible school and I dropped out, and I grew a ponytail and I started smoking and I got a tattoo, and what else do you do after you drop out of Bible school? And you start working in inner city Chicago as an ER trauma nurse. About 12 years later, I decided to go back to school for software engineering. I tried a bunch of different things while I was in nursing. I went to college for about 12 years. I tried theology, philosophy, history, art. I tried publishing some articles. I wanted to be an animator or a sculptor. I thought and took some classes in industrial design, and I thought, maybe I can do something creative, and do art and get paid to be creative that way. We moved to LA. I tried to get into the film industry as a visual effects guy doing animation. My wife and I met in Chicago, and she was working for a huge tech firm. And after they got acquired, it wasn't a startup anymore. And so she said, screw this, I'm going to go to film school. So we were both in LA trying to get into the film industry. And a friend of mine who teaches visual effects at Sony ImageWorks and now at DreamWorks, he was like, dude, you don't want this job. It's a sweatshop. If you really want to do anything creative in the film industry, be a programmer. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, be a programmer. Like, these are art shops. No one yells at them for their code. And you still get to work with the fun stuff. And you work, a 40-hour work week instead of 100 hours. And it's salaried instead of paid overtime and blah, blah, blah. So that kind of made a lot of sense to me at the time. So I went back to school for software engineering because I really liked it. And I started hearing about the startup thing. And I'm like, that's the thing. It's creative. It's problem solving. It's solving money as a problem. I hated the idea that I was selling hours of my life as a nurse, doing something that I really found distasteful. You do a good job because of your coworkers, because of the patients. You do the right thing, absolutely. But, I just go home and I'd be a wreck, and I was depressed. And I hated the idea of selling hours of my life for dollars when I really wanted to do other things. And I kind of felt like a whore because my life and my time is the most precious thing that I had. And I'm selling that so I can afford to live. And the idea of trying to sell something else was really appealing. And then when I heard that you can sell a company, I was like, holy crap. I could make $5 million selling a company, and then I could retire. So I came to Silicon Valley with this idea was I was going to learn how to sell a company for $5 million so I could retire. And if it took me 10 years to do that, I was like, it's all right. I could do that. So I'm kind of a strange kid, and that's kind of a strange way to get to Silicon Valley, but it's actually been surprisingly helpful.
Yeah, it's one of the more winding roads to the valley that I think I've heard.
Yes, I've always been a problem child.
So what was it like growing up in the 80s in Central America as a missionary? Or a son of a missionary? Yeah.
It was normal to me, of course. In hindsight, we were in Honduras my parents were there from 67 to 77. I was there for the last 4 years of that. When my parents lived there, there were 30 coups d'etats in Honduras in
Wow.
10 years. Um, at one point in time, there's this thing called the soccer war between Honduras and El Salvador. A soccer match got out of hand, and the two countries had a 7-day war because of it. Um, so the army actually made us, at the school my parents ran, they made us get blackout curtains and blackwash all of the windows so that no lights would come out. And we were to hoist an American flag above the school so we wouldn't get bombed. My older brothers, I mean, we were in the middle of friggin' nowhere in Honduras. My older brothers actually saw machete fights.
Wow.
Dudes, like, drunks pissed at each other, like, swinging machetes at each other. We moved to this little country that no one had ever heard of in 1978 called Costa Rica. We were there from 78 to 88. I thought it was normal to ride the sea turtles because the park rangers really liked the little blonde kid. They really hadn't seen a blonde kid before, and they're like, "Here, sit on the sea turtle. It'll be fun." When I was growing up, I really liked monkeys until a howler monkey peed on me. I was then very, very angry at monkeys, and I have a dark little place in my soul for howler monkeys ever since. It was a trip. I mean, we'd come back and forth to the United States every couple of years. In Costa Rica, we were really wealthy because there was a currency crisis and we got paid in dollars. When we came back to the States, we were actually quite poor because Dad was a preacher. So we got all of our clothes out of like missionary barrels and garage sales when we were in the States. And then in Costa Rica, when we were back there, we'd go to the beach and stay at a great hotel a couple times a year. We'd eat lobster. It really kind of messes with your head when it comes to like figuring out how money works. The exchange rate in Costa Rica went from 8 to 1 to 160 to 1 in 10 years while we were there.
Wow.
And so, my friends growing up had been like really upper middle class. And then toward them, they would go to Miami for vacations all the time when they first moved there. After that, they couldn't even afford to buy a car. And I just thought it was normal. I had a brother that was kidnapped by the Contras for a day. He got away. Just thought, cool story, bro.
Yeah. So what were some of the biggest things you learned from your time in Central America growing up? Besides, not get peed on by howler monkeys.
One of the biggest things that I learned, my parents were very big on not being the gringo know-it-all assholes.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't say that because they're preachers, but they actually tried very hard to adapt to the culture. One of the things my dad said, and my dad was essentially a leader in the mission organization where he was with for a number of years. And so people would just stop by the house all day long to talk with Don Carlos. My mom once tracked how many cups of coffee and cookies she gave to people just stopping by. 1 month of February, she served coffee to 450 people.
Wow.
And that was just, yes. Ding dong. Hey, is Don Carlos here? And one of the things my dad said was, it's amazing how much you can get done if you don't care who gets the credit for it. And what he did all the time was he spitballed ideas. The team that they went to Costa Rica with in 10 years, they started 50 churches. They was a team of 8 families. They started 50 churches. They rehabbed 3 youth camps. They started an undergrad seminary in San Jose with 27 extension locations around the country. And they started a cooperative lending fund so that a church could essentially get a loan at less than a 45% interest rate because that's what the banks were charging. And that was just kind of life. And Dad worked 100, 120 hours a week. And, we still went to the beach a couple times a year and had a good time and spent time in the jungle and, spent time in a, very cosmopolitan city. And I still remember Dad saying it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Like, Dad was never one to kind of beat his own chest and say, this is what I did. He loved to encourage other people. He'd suggest an idea to someone, and then he'd come back to him a couple of weeks later, and they'd say, hey, Charlie, this is the idea that I have. What do you think? And it was Dad's idea that he'd pitched him before, and he was like, that's a great idea. I think you should go with that. Do it. And then they would run off and they would do it. And honestly, it's what I spend a lot of my time doing now is with entrepreneurs. I learned that leading is oftentimes an act of service. This, also comes from the religious background that my parents were with, is, helping people accomplish what it is that they want to do and getting them and giving them the tools that they actually need to do that. In my mind, that's what I think leadership really is. That's what I think a CEO's job is to do, is to point the direction of the company and get people excited about that direction, and then to solve all of the problems that your team has in getting there. And helping them grow, helping them do their best, giving them their tools that they need, solving obstacles for them. That was something that I learned down there as well, which is surprising. Doing stuff for kind of entrepreneurs who are kind of who don't really have a whole lot. My family spent a lot of time in really indigent communities helping them out. Turns out that entrepreneurs, when they first start out, are really broke. And it takes a number of years, and they're fairly indigent. And it takes them 8 years to become an overnight success. And those first 8 years really suck. And it turns out that just helping people out and doing business by saying, how can I help? In startup land turns out to actually be a great little bit of business. I started thinking of Silicon Valley about 8 years ago. I said, what if this is like a role-playing game where I'm essentially trying to level up, and I've got to do actions to gain points so that I can get better tools to do this. And I said, so how do you level up in startup land in Silicon Valley? Like being helpful to people, check. Making a really good introduction to someone who's higher level than you, check. Helping people out, paying it forward, check. And turns out that was actually really good business. I decided that I wanted to be one of the most helpful people around town. And if all things are considered, if you can do a business with an asshole or you can do a business with a really nice guy, you're probably going to do business with a really nice guy or the really nice lady. And that's also something that I learned growing up. I don't think it necessarily had to do with Costa Rica, but the Latin American relationships and the focus on people, I think was really, really helpful and formational to me. If you help, and I learned this as a nurse as well. At one point I managed 700 people in a hospital. I was queen bee on the night shift. I spent a lot of time being a charge nurse and running, 30, 35 crabby nurses, 6 techs, 2 lab techs, 4 doctors and a PA. And when things got really, really busy and really, really crazy, and no one could no one had a chance to go pee, you couldn't eat, you couldn't go on breaks. I'd order a pizza, and I would get these little Post-it cards, and I would just write people, a little 10-word, hey, thank you so much for working, you did a great job here. And I just stick it in their pocket and say, hey, there's some pizza for you. Little stuff like that. People will lay down in traffic for you. Like if you say, hey, can you go to Highway 101 and just lay down in the center lane for about 15 minutes? I just got to do a thing. They'll be like, okay. And they'll go do it. Why? Because you've been decent to them and they trust you. That I think I also started learning in Central America. That whole pay it forward kind of startup mentality that the best of startup land actually does. So I being in a currency crisis, I don't know that I learned this, but I learned that money is a really weird thing, that money changes value, and that money as a concept is very strange. That's led me to thinking about money, I think, in very different ways.
How would you say you think of it differently than other people?
Like, for instance, I came to Silicon Valley when I was a nurse. One of the things you did is, how does blood flow throughout the circulatory system of the human body? It starts in the heart, it goes to the lungs, it comes back to the heart, it goes out to the rest of the body, stops by the kidneys, blah, 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 dropping off food, and then it comes back up, it stops up at the kidneys, the liver, the whole 9 yards, and picks up trash, and then takes it to the heart and takes it away. And you go back through the lungs again to pick up oxygen. And so when I started trying to figure out how money flowed through Silicon Valley, like how the money of Silicon Valley worked, my mental model was, how does money flow throughout the ecosystem? And that's a biological mental model. So, money comes from VCs. Okay, where do they get their money from? They get their money from funds of funds or rich families or pension funds. Okay, what's a fund of funds? It's a fund that just invests in other investors. Okay, where do they get their money from? Well, rich families and pension funds and endowments. Okay. Well, I have a pension fund as a nurse. Well, yeah, some of my pension money actually ends up to startups. Oh. Okay. Well, how would I get my money back as a nurse? Well, out of every $1 billion that goes in to entrepreneurs, everybody takes a little piece and a little bit of management fee, and that's completely understandable. But out of every $1 billion that it comes out of nurses' pockets, it tends to be only about $700 million over 10 years that actually ends up in the hands of the entrepreneurs just because of management fees. And that's completely reasonable. I mean, everybody's got to make a living. And then the profit model of venture funds and funds of funds is that every $1 billion in profit that entrepreneurs generate, the VCs take a little piece. It's profit sharing. That's reasonable. And the fund of funds takes a little piece. But then a nurse will struggle to do 5 to 6% a year in their pension fund. So in my mind, the capital circulating throughout the ecosystem is circulating inefficiently. And what if we could essentially have the money flow from the nurses to the entrepreneurs? Which led me to, I advise a law school in Silicon Valley they provide legal services to startups. I advised that program, and through that, we submitted 80 pages of comments to the SEC on crowdfunding. Why? Because nurses should be able to invest directly into entrepreneurs. And if they can build a broad enough portfolio, angel investors, when they do that, they tend to do about 25 to 30% year over year. And so we should let nurses be able to invest into a portfolio of 20 to 25 companies. And, if I could do 20 to 25% year over year, maybe I wouldn't have been a nurse for 20 years. And that model is biological. I think of companies as, kind of tiny little creatures. I think of startup ecosystems. I've been running startup events, and what I see these little entrepreneurs kind of floating around this little primordial entrepreneurial ecosystem soup, and then these entrepreneurs will clump together, and then they'll start making a little widget, little thing. No one wants it. What is it? I don't know. It's a thing. And then occasionally these little creatures will evolve, and they'll make a product. And the difference between a widget and a product is that someone actually wants the product. Okay, and at that point, this little creature kind of crawls out of the soup and crawls up onto the beach. And then they figure out how to sell this product quickly, and then this little creature evolves again, and it sprouts wings. And then we can get this creature capital, which is kind of company food, and then the company grows, and so you have this kind of big, buzzy creature flying around. And then at some point, some sort of magical event happens. It's a metamorphosis, but this giant kind of flying around startup creature ends up metamorphosing into a unicorn. And a unicorn is a massive tech company, and they go around acquiring other startups and eating them. And then they shit gold all the way into the ecosystem and fertilize this primordial soup of entrepreneurs who clump together, and they, little pieces of startups break off inside of the unicorn, and they spin off and they start their own company again. In my mind, that's kind of the complete life cycle. That's the carbon life cycle of startups. I haven't heard anybody else describe it that way, but that's my mental framework. And I learned finance from the grassroots up. I learned startup finance from the grassroots up. I've never actually studied it formally. I'm an obsessive reader. The 2008, 2009 economic disaster was fascinating to me. I was pretty insulated because I was working as a nurse and being in tech. But what I learned from that is, holy crap, you can put a legal wrapping around mortgages and then sell that? What if we did that for startup stock?
Mm-hmm.
And that honestly was the beginning of our business model. Was we created a legal shell around startup stock, and we sliced it up and we sold part of the pie, and we kept part of the pie.
So can you explain in more detail for people who don't understand your model of slicing it up? What does that look like, and what does somebody that wants to invest in one of your co-ops look like?
No, absolutely. So we essentially become Uber advisors to our companies. We have a team of 18 people now in 3 different countries that supports our portfolio of 55, 60 companies. And so we do everything from find them housing to find them daycare. I have a doctor who's on call for me. I text him and he will see a patient or a CEO or founder of mine within 24 hours. We can help with visas, banking, legal. So for all of those services, they pay us stock. And rather than pay us to our company directly, we set up a separate holding company. It's just a tiny little legal shell, and its only purpose in life is to hold startup stock. This legal shell is comprised of 1 million shares, and hackers and founders will keep about 300,000 of those shares. The founders in our co-op will each get about 10,000 shares of this holding company apiece. And then about 500,000 of these holding company shares get sold to investors, and that's how we pay our bills. And so we all have the same stock. We all end up, we only make money together. One of us succeeds, we all succeed. And so we've sold pieces of 4 of these little stock pools to about 115 investors over the last 5 years. We've raised about $3 million through selling those. And that's what pays our staff salaries, and that's what lets us have such a large team to actually provide services to our companies. We're landing here.
And how many people are on your team across Silicon Valley and the rest of the places where you have your pools?
18 people.
That's a big team.
Yeah, it's huge. Compared to like a venture fund, a $3 million venture fund might have one person who doesn't work for a salary, or maybe 2, depending on where they're at and what their cost of living is. Being able to do it this way actually gets us a lot more abilities to pay for services. We can, pay for design services. We can help with legal. We can do all sorts of interesting stuff that we have that ability.
No, that's really cool. And so going back to your mental model of the startup ecosystem, what did you see that made you decide you wanted to move into Mexico and do a cohort there?
Honestly, it was the explosion in startup activity that was happening in Latin America. We've really followed the growth of our community. Um, so a guy by the name of Mac Gutierrez was running events for years in Guadalajara. Um, then I ended up learning that Guadalajara, Mexico, has more engineers than all of Ireland, um, which is pretty shocking to me. I don't think of engineering talent when I think of Guadalajara, Mexico. I do now, but I didn't then. And really, it was Max just building community. 6 years ago when he started, there were maybe 2 startup events a month. Now there's an ecosystem. There's probably anywhere between 40 to 80 startup events every month in Guadalajara, Mexico. And we had figured out our business model here in Silicon Valley. And I just said, we've got to figure out a way to give Mac working on this full time. And so we ended up, and he had helped, I think, about 14 companies get funded out of this community. And I said, Mac should actually get a little bit of upside for doing all of that hard work in the community. And so we built kind of a co-op around him to make his life sustainable and be able to build a team there. And, we've been doing it for a year and a half now and have, I think, our first 10 or 12 companies. I forget. I know that we have a couple more that are in the pipeline, but it was really following the explosion of interest in community groundwork. And really it was Mac who kind of led a lot of that. And I just said, we've got to do something to actually make this more sustainable. And it was a similar sort of passion activity that I actually saw when I went to Santiago and Startup Chile and spoke there a couple of times. I'm frankly much more excited about what's happening in the startup scene in Latin America than I am about Silicon Valley.
And why do you think that?
At least for me, nothing against old rich white guys. I have a couple of old rich white guys as friends. My dad is an old rich white guy. But making a lot of money for old rich white guys isn't really exciting to me. What's exciting to me is being able to put shoes on tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of little kids. My original dream was to come to Silicon Valley, sell a company for $5 million, and then retire back to Costa Rica or Honduras and live like a king and figure out how to help, these people start businesses and support themselves. How do we get shoes on those little kids? We've ended up being in a position where I think that we can truly help more tech companies be more successful in emerging markets. And I think we can build new products to help develop these entire ecosystems. And over the course of the next 20 years, I'm convinced that will put shoes on hundreds of thousands of little kids. And that is something that will keep me going 80 to 100 hours a week.
I think in addition to helping out those at the farthest at the bottom, the startup activity, especially in Chile that we've seen, is having a big effect on the middle class, in that in Chile and other countries in Latin America are pretty similar, but in Chile, you're in the top 15% in income if you make about $1,800 per month. And half of the people in the country make a minimum wage. And a lot of that is because of poorly designed government incentives on when you pay tax and things like that, where you get a lot of side benefits, like you get food paid for, or you get like these restaurant tickets or gym memberships or non-monetary compensation for things. But when you have startups that are coming in, and all a startup cares about is getting the best talent, and a startup will compete with getting really good people in and import some of the best practices from the US, like, everyone's getting stock options and everyone's getting things like, for example, there's companies that will pay a little bit of your principal on your student loan if you show that you're paying your student loan. And that will lower your payback period by years because you're paying direct principal. And so we've been experimenting with that in Santiago as well, and because we saw that happening in the U.S. And it's like for $25 a month extra, you can knock off a year or 2 years of payment time for somebody on a student loan. And these are types of things that are changing the types of jobs that normal people want to go work for. I think it's one of the biggest surprises that I found in Latin America was the work culture compared to the US at many of the bigger kind of old stodgy companies. I mean, I have a friend who works at a bank in Chile, and generally like once a quarter, they'll call everyone into a room together and they'll go, you and you're done, you're out, just to keep people on just to keep people on their toes. And that will never happen in a startup. And it's a completely different, right? So it's a completely different way of doing it, where I think you get at the bottom, you're definitely putting shoes on kids' feet, but then you're also changing the culture with sort of that middle class by having a completely different view on how startups, like management and workers, interact.
One of the things, I was talking to some friends from Colombia, and they were also expressed a shock in Silicon Valley work culture from Colombian work culture. I mean, there you show up at 5 to 9 and you leave at 6 p.m., not 6:05, but at 6 p.m., and you don't speak to your boss until spoken to, and you have exactly this much for lunch. Really, really rigid. And I was like, really? Like, how do you not have non-resentful employees then?
Well, you don't.
Well, isn't that kind of counterproductive? And but yeah, there's also been there's a really interesting book that really kind of changed the way I thought about this as well. It's called The New Geography of Jobs, and they examine job creation in startup and tech hubs. And out of every job that happens at a startup, a high-paying tech job, there are 5 other services jobs, high-paying services jobs that prop up around them. 1 or 2 will be like a lawyer or a doctor, and then 3 like, service providers to those companies. And so, yeah, you end up changing company culture. You end up becoming much more competitive for talent. Startups, you end up valuing people and their abilities instead of their backgrounds and their prestige, because nobody's got time for that kind of BS in a startup. Because we either, we live or we die by what we do. And, in the best way, in the best places, it can be very, very meritocratic. There are people who are pedigreed who have, much easier time raising money and that sort of stuff. But at the same time, overall, startups are fundamentally meritocratic systems. And I love that. I love that, 2 guys who ended up learning how to program after attending a Hackers and Founders event 5 years ago in Guadalajara were the first company into our founders co-op. And they are now, one of the top performing companies in our portfolio down there. And they have 15 employees, and they're profitable, and they're growing, 20% month over month. They're fantastic. And I love the passion that they're also bringing to the table. I think a different thing with entrepreneurs in Latin America that I've seen is that people can do it, yes, just for the money, but a lot of them want to do it because they actually want to see change in their culture and in their country.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. We've seen not even people that are thinking about, I want to have an exit for 5 million, 10 million, $100 million. They say, I want to show that I'm the first person from my area of the city or from my family that's built their own business that actually pays everybody a good salary. Because they've seen what their parents, how they worked and at the jobs that they worked at, and they want to make a change.
Yep. Yeah, no, one of our companies in Mexico, they do on-demand house cleaning, like an Uber for maids. But the founder is absolutely insistent that all of her on-demand employees have benefits vacation, get health insurance, and they get paid 2 to 3 times what an average, maid would actually work. And she actually sells the service as a premium service to her customers. And when people balk at the prices, she's like, you want amazing service. These are my ladies. This is how I take care of them. And you're not only getting a great product and a great job placing house, you can trust these people, but you also know that you're actually helping not just them, but their entire families. And it's a lot more, I don't want to say it's not really impact entrepreneurship, but it's entrepreneurship, and they firmly believe in the impact that it can have.
So what are you doing to scale this now that you've had your first cohort in Mexico? What's the next step to continue to make impact across LATAM?
So the next step for us is I needed to find a legal vehicle so that we could take this 10 to 100x. I can only have 100 investors in one of my holding companies, and that's just kind of a U.S. law. I really want to crowdfund a fund for a long, long time. That's really hard, if not close to impossible to do in the United States. So we've actually decided to create a venture ETF, but we're actually using a cryptocurrency. We're launching our own hack coin. And the goal is I would love to have 10 to 20,000 small investors be able to put money into this and support a portfolio of 200 companies scaling across Latin America. And I think having this community-focused kind of venture fund, letting the nurses be able to put their $50 a month into this broad portfolio, I think is going to be really transformative. And I'm really excited about it. So we're launching our own cryptocurrency in mid-October.
And so what would I get if I decide when I go in on launch that I want to invest $1,000 in Hackcoin? What do I get?
So you get a little piece of 200 companies. You get there's only going to be a limited number of coins that we actually sell. If one of our companies exits or IPOs, we're going to take that money and we're going to buy back coins on the market, and then we're going to destroy them. So there will be even less coins as we grow. So the idea that it will become much more valuable. The other half of the money that we have will reinvest. So you'll get a coin that's essentially, instead of in the early days of money where you had $1 that you could take to a bank and get a little bit of gold back, it was a gold-backed currency, we will actually have a startup stock-backed currency. And so you will get the appreciation and value across the entire portfolio. You will also have the ability to help us select the companies. So we have a peer review process that when people actually apply to our program, they get reviewed and scored by other entrepreneurs. So we're going to actually include Hackcoin owners in that process. We're talking about letting some of the people who have a significant number of Hackcoin, if they're interested in interviewing the founders before they join our program, we might let them do that. And you get, essentially to be one of the first people to invest in a venture ETF in the world, and watch us try to not just improve lives and make like suck less for founders, but you also help to be a part of kind of helping the startup movement across the Americas and emerging markets, which I'm really passionate about. So you get the opportunity to make money, hopefully make a lot of money, and you also get the opportunity to do some good and have some fun by watching 200 startups grow and know that you have a piece of them.
No, that's really cool. And so what's your vision for the next, say, 5 to 10 years in Latin America?
So the next 5 or 10 years, I think that we need to actually figure out better ways to get money to startups in the region. The entire Spanish-speaking world is 10% of the world's economy. It receives less than $350 million a year in angel, venture, and private equity combined, which is kind of crazy. And I mean, that's like one check in Silicon Valley. You know, more Bitcoin gets traded back and forth in a single day than all of the stocks on the Chilean stock market in a month. And so I think that we fundamentally need to improve and innovate on how we actually get money to startups in these emerging markets. I would love to create a NASDAQ for Latin America. I would love to help see companies, instead of IPO on the NASDAQ stock exchange, I would love to see them be able to launch their own coin and let that coin trade on a Latin American NASDAQ. I would love in 10 years to be able to have a platform so that companies can quickly scale across from, Mexico to Colombia to Peru to Chile to Argentina, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Guatemala, Ecuador, the whole region, to actually help companies scale across the entire region, so that we can truly start to make it a more profitable region to invest in, so that we can actually have more entrepreneurs build cool things and provide better jobs for people, and put a lot of shoes on a lot of little kids.
I think that's where it's going. I mean, we've seen even just since 2010 when I first got to Chile, we talked about this on the pre-call with, people would look at you like you were more or less homeless if you said you were a startup founder. And that's now changed. And so the first kind of step in that ecosystem has been built, and maybe the second step is starting to be built now. And I think there's clearly going to be massive growth in tech in Latin America over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yep. And a lot of people in Silicon Valley are kind of ignoring it to their detriment. And, I'm actually really excited about the opportunities. I'm excited the opportunity to actually change people's lives and make them better. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun in the meantime.
For sure. And so I always like to end with these two questions. So if you could go back to when you first started Hackers and Founders, knowing what you know today, what would you tell yourself for advice?
Do a better job at hiring in general. Learning how to hire is really hard. Finding great people to work with is really hard. Learning how to help a hire that isn't working out move on to find something better is also really hard. That's probably what I would have told myself. I don't know how I could have helped myself learn better or faster had I not gone through that misery. So
it's the best way to learn.
That's it. Pain-driven development.
And the other way to learn is, you talked about you really like to read. So what are your top couple of books that you would recommend either to a startup founder or somebody that's thinking about doing business in Latin America? Very different questions, but you can go either way with it.
A startup founder, the last book that I read was Ben Horowitz's The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I love the first half of the book where he just talks about the misery of being a founder. And that was, in my mind, very cathartic. I've been really kind of obsessive about Audible and audiobooks recently. There have been a couple of really good audiobooks or audio classes that I've actually learned, that I've gone through on finance and economics and startup stock. The Ascent of Money by Neil Ferguson, just kind of a history of how money works. It's actually really, really good. There was an economic history of the world since 1400, which was fascinating to me. And then the last one, which was also really good, this sciencey nerdy, was A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson. And those were really cool. And then for Latin America specifically, there's a course on Audible called The Americas in the Revolutionary Era. And it basically goes through all of Latin America and compares the American Revolutionary War, with the Haitian Revolution, with the Cuban Revolution, with Simón Bolívar and the Mexican Revolution and the South American revolutions. That was fascinating. To think of it, United States, it was initially a federation of independent little kind of countries. Latin America might have been able to be a United States of Latin America. They didn't end up working together as much as the United States did. But it was fascinating to actually look at all of those different histories, and you can kind of see in the culture of every country in Latin America where a lot of that started from just how the countries started, which was fascinating to me. I'd never learned that even growing up in Central America.
That's super interesting. I'm going to definitely add that one to my reading list.
Awesome.
Well, where can people find more about you and Hackers and Founders and the HackCoin?
Absolutely. So our website is hf.cx. And you can find out about our coin offering at ico.hf.cx. And that'll be launching in mid-October, but we do have some pre-sales going on now.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for taking the time to do the podcast. I hope we can connect again after the coin goes out and catch up and see how it's all going.
Absolutely, Nathan. Thank you so much, man. I love the work you do, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Same goes for you. I really appreciate it again, and have a good rest of your day.
Awesome. Cheers.
Thanks. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jonathan Nelson on this episode of Crossing Borders. If you did, please recommend to a friend. It's the best way for Crossing Borders to grow and for more people to hear about these amazing stories of Latin American entrepreneurs and the people that support them. I would always appreciate a review on iTunes and a subscription on Stitcher if you're at all inclined. Definitely appreciate it. So thanks again for listening, and see you next time.